Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Pat Zerke, Director of the Forum. For 36 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. American educators, policymakers, and parents seem overwhelmed by the needs of our current public education system, and our public schools seem unable to meet all the demands society places upon them. Public education in the United States today is in need of a redefined contract with the society that supports it. How can we better prepare children for life as citizens, workers, and responsible adults in the 21st century? The third of 4 programs on schools and society focuses on assessing success, examining the growing role of high-stakes testing within our schools. Who is being tested and why? What are the alternative methods to ensure school accountability? Here to discuss these questions is Paul Reville, Executive Director of the Center for Education Research and Policy at Mass Inc., the Massachusetts Institute for a New Commonwealth, a nonpartisan policy think tank. In addition, Paul Reville is a lecturer in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Executive Director of the Pew Forum on Standards-Based Reform. He was also co-founder and Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, providing key conceptual and political support for the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993. And he currently chairs the Massachusetts Education Reform Review Commission. A former principal and teacher, he received his master's in education from Stanford University. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Paul Reville.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you all for turning out at this busy time of year in this horrible New England weather to hear my remarks tonight. I'm honored to have the opportunity to address you this evening on a subject of such great importance. As I prepared for tonight, I thought about how I began my career as a street worker, a youth worker, not far from here, in Somerville, where I was part of a team that founded and led a street academy for high school dropouts some 30 years ago. The name of the school was the Full Circle School. It seems as though I myself have come full circle in being back here in almost the same neighborhood to talk with you tonight about the very same issues that motivated me so long ago. My talk tonight, in what I assume was a stab at humor, had been described as, quote, the trouble with MCAS, unquote. It was also described as about whether or not there's a role for testing and evaluating school success. I will touch on these topics. I intend to make a strong case for the use of MCAS and other forms of testing to assess student and school performance. However, I want to start by talking not about the trouble with MCAS, but the trouble with the MCAS debate. This being Cambridge, I'm assuming there are a number of MCAS opponents in the audience. I'm here not to harangue you or to change your minds, but rather to explain my position. Before I start, I have to say that this debate about MCAS and assessments has gone on for a long, long time here in Massachusetts. The debate has been healthy for the most part, but it's now in danger of getting old, overdone. At some point, we need to stop wrangling over the measuring stick and sharpen our focus on the real problem, which is inequality. We have to make schools better and more effective in educating children. Accountability is here to stay. Large-scale assessments, whether we like them or not, are likely to be with us for a long time. We need to figure out how to work with them, preferably, or around them if you're unalterably opposed, but it's time to refocus on increased learning for kids. I have to begin by saying that I think it is at worst a tragedy and at best a shameful waste that so many of us potential allies in the quest to make schools serve all children better, so many of us who should be on the same side campaigning together for equity and excellence, are so deeply divided by the set of strategies that have come to be known as standards-based reform. The school reform community, the civil rights community, children's advocates across the country are at odds, at loggerheads, over the issue of standards, assessments, and stakes for performance. In our vigorous disagreement, not only have we lost an opportunity to benefit children, but we have alienated one another and set back the overall children's cause in which we all believe. Because we believe deeply, we argue passionately. Our rhetoric soars, and we, most of us, indulge in demeaning or even demonizing our opponents. so feeding a growing sense of fracture and alienation among those who should be unified in their interests. In so doing, we are expending our political and intellectual capital in our combat with one another. While we are distracted with our testing battles, we are losing ground in the war to force our society to do better by our children, particularly those least fortunate. This is the sadness. This is the trouble with the MCAS debate. I am guilty, as perhaps some of you may be. I don't know how to fix the situation, but I do know that dialogue is better than war. So in the interest of dialogue, I'm going to use my time tonight to explain my position and the position of those political, policy, business, and school leaders, those citizens, teachers, parents, and students who believe that standards-based reform is the best available strategy for improving schools and providing equity to our students. In this way, I hope to contribute to better understanding and a more complex dialogue on where we go from here. Why we believe in standards, assessment, and accountability. First of all, you should know that I approach this topic informed by my service as a teacher, principal of 2 alternative high schools, an advocate and architect of school reform in Massachusetts, a former member of our State Board of Education, and a variety of different positions that you just heard described that I won't enumerate. Especially, and finally, as a parent of 6 children who have had various experiences with MCAS and with standards and assessment. My perspective is based on experience. In a nutshell, my view is that high-stakes testing is a powerful strategic instrument which, when properly employed as an element of standards-based reform, can be a vital lever for achieving equity in American public education. I would unabashedly join with William Taylor, one of our nation's most distinguished civil rights advocates, who has stated, quote, "The standards movement could be the most important vehicle for the educational progress of minority and poor students since Brown v. Board of Education," unquote. Let me explain the basis for this view. Standards-based school reform, an approach to school improvement that is driven by its focus on equity, is now our national school reform strategy. It has been adopted independently by virtually all of the states. It has recently been adopted and implemented as federal education policy through the No Child Left Behind Act. This reform strategy, which has been rapidly developing since its first articulation and appearance in the early 1990s, is based on a simple set of common sense principles and practices. The strategy calls for high standards for all students. These standards should reflect the basic requirements for citizenship as well as entry-level success in higher education and employment. Progress in achieving the standards should be measured with regular assessments for diagnostic and accountability purposes and followed up with a set of consequences, that is, an accountability system based on performance. Equally important and too often forgotten, the strategy calls for both capacity building, providing teachers the training and support they need to assist students in meeting new higher education goals, and opportunity to learn, by which is meant providing each student with quality teaching, a curriculum aligned with standards, regular feedback on performance, and extra help when needed. In addition, students need access to other supports we know are crucial, such as quality preschool, full-day kindergarten, and smaller classes in early grades. Underlying this basic strategy is a radical set of beliefs which guide the proposed changes for American education. Foremost among these is the revolutionary belief that all children, and in the rhetoric of the reform, all means all, no excuses, no exceptions, can learn at high levels. With the exception of the 1 or 2% of children who have been victims of some form of brain damage and therefore may not achieve at the levels prescribed for others, and these children, too, can be expected to perform at steadily higher levels than has historically been expected of them. The new standards, although challenging, are well within the intellectual grasp of all of our children. A corollary of the high expectations for all students is the belief that fairness requires us as a nation to have the same high expectations of all students, irrespective of their backgrounds. These reforms seek to realize the American myth, sadly so far from reality, that public schools are the great equalizer. In pursuit of this goal, we refuse to any longer make the automatic assumption that we should have higher educational expectations for affluent children than we have for poor children. We know that the typical grade of A in the suburbs is usually represented far more learning than the typical A that is awarded in the inner city school. These reforms say that those discriminatory expectations are now intolerable. Not only do we believe that all children can learn at high levels, but the knowledge now exists to make this happen. All students are entitled to graduate from school having achieved proficiency, that is, being masters of the knowledge and skill they will need to be successful in higher education, future employment, as citizens and as heads of families. Under these reforms, performance matters. Learning matters not only for the students, but for the adults in the educational system. No longer is trying hard good enough. Policymakers, administrators, and teachers need to be sharply focused on putting in place the conditions that will lead to the attainment of the high standards by all students. Make no mistake, this is a monumental challenge for American education. It has changed forever the nature of the industry. We are far from having attained our ambitious goals, but we are making progress in learning as we go. Some critics would have us abandon ship because school reform strategies have not been immediately successful or perfected. Those of us who believe in these strategies see them as having already struck a mighty blow for the poor and disadvantaged. We want to build on the progress rather than letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. All of us in the world of education need to recommit to the goal of proficiency for all by doing our share, assuming our respective responsibilities and accountability for providing each child with the opportunity to become proficient. A return to the status quo ante, the manifestly failing system of education that preceded these reforms, is simply unacceptable. Fairness demands it. Can we seriously any longer contemplate having standards that apply differently to different children? Can we have urban standards and suburban standards, high for the rich, low for the poor? Who will choose which group should be expected to achieve more? You or me? The teacher? The school? The state? The federal government? Who chooses? Who loses? Fairness demands that we set clear and challenging standards which reflect the knowledge and skills our children will need to be successful in this economy, in this democratic society, in a life of continuing learning, and as heads of families. Fairness demands that we expect the same of all, that we provide all with the opportunity to learn, and that we hold all of our students and their educators accountable for their share of the learning. Fairness requires that we award to every student a diploma that actually stands for the achievement of a defined body of learning, rather than awarding diplomas for social promotion. Fairness requires disciplining the system to deliver full learning opportunities for all children. Fairness means providing incentives for those who achieve, data to all parents and students, and help to those who need it. Fairness demands not artificially shielding students from stress and judgment by society, since this is the reality of the world they inhabit. Fairness demands consequences for performance. The high stakes are just one part of the complex web of strategies that make up systemic standards-based reform. The tests, often confused with the reform, are merely a tool of the reform, the yardstick with which progress is measured, an instrument not only of accountability, but a diagnostic tool to provide valuable information to teachers. Critics are fond of proclaiming the obvious, that education cannot be improved by tests, that, quote, no one ever fattened a cow by weighing it, unquote. But of course, no reformer ever thought this. Rather, tests were instituted to measure the degree to which our educational goals were being realized, the degree to which students had attained proficiency, and to expose the weaknesses of our current strategies, thereby forcing action for improvement. Other common criticisms of the tests and the standards underlying them are that standards equal standardization, dictate a narrow curriculum, promote teaching to the test, and encourage low-grade teaching. Let me quickly address these critiques. High, clear, lean standards establish goals for education. We need to know where we are going if we intend to get there. Students are entitled to know what they are expected to learn. However, there are many roads to Rome. Good teachers know dozens of strategies to apply in moving various students to higher levels of literacy or mathematical proficiency. There is nothing in the standards that calls for a particular curriculum or a particular educational approach. It is true that consequential tests tend to focus attention on the subjects tested. We make no apologies that MCAS requires schools to pay particular attention to literacy and math skills. Obviously, school and a good education should be about much, much more than literacy and numeracy. But without proficiency in these areas, students will be unable to participate fully as citizens, as learners, as workers, and as heads of families. The Commonwealth is saying that at a minimum, graduates of our public schools ought to be competent in English and math. That is the least we can do for our children. Standards-based reforms envisions tests that are as rich and diverse in their methodology as are the standards to be measured. Done properly, these tests should be tests we would like teachers to teach to. They measure students' progress in achieving the criteria for success. They provide specific data to teachers so that teachers can address students' learning deficits. Many tests, especially nationally norm reference tests, do not align with state standards and are not helpful as educational tools. MCAS tests align directly with state standards. Employ a wide range of methodologies and do provide useful data to teachers and others. If you haven't seen the MCAS tests, I would encourage you to go to the Massachusetts Department of Education's website and look at the questions. After you do, ask yourself which questions you would prefer your child not to be able to answer. Finally, some say that MCAS encourages the worst kind of retrograde drill-and-kill teaching. Undoubtedly, there are some instances where this is the case, in spite of the fact that this kind of teaching is not particularly successful in boosting MCAS performance. When human beings are anxious, as some teachers are with the advent of standards, they revert to what they consider the basics. And for some, drill-and-kill test preparation is what they learned as children. Our belief is that the fact that we can find isolated instances of poor practice in response to standards is not a reason to abandon standards, but rather to invest in intensive professional development to improve the standard of teaching practice. We do not think MCAS tests are perfect. However, we are proud of the fact that a variety of groups, liberal and conservative, have rated these tests as among the top in the country. Yet we are still arguing about the tests. It often seems as though critics want us to believe that if we just got the testing instrument right, then all children would be able to demonstrate mastery. This is manifestly false. MCAS tests show what virtually all tests have generally shown, that knowledge and skill in our society are unequally and unfairly distributed. Again, we can continue to argue about the measuring stick, or we can commit ourselves to solving the fundamental underlying problem, inequality. The stakes associated with the tests are a separate and distinct policy intervention designed to create incentives for effort and performance. Much of the controversy surrounding the standards movement concerns the stakes, not the tests. The stakes make the test results matter, make performance count. The stakes are the fulcrum of the accountability system, an essential, pivotal component. They create the urgency, the push to dislodge the low expectations that characterize the status quo and create the widely disparate impact of our current ineffective and unequal system of public schooling. Historically, tests without stakes have seldom driven change or improvement. For example, in Massachusetts, we've had countless standardized tests over the years that have demonstrated the widespread, very well-known, and commonly accepted inequity in education. Typically, the results of these tests were accepted with a shrug of resignation and nothing changed. Now we have the MCAS. The results demonstrate the same inequities, but this time there are stakes, and suddenly change is everywhere. More resources and attention than ever before are aimed at those children who we have historically least well served in education. Teachers are engaged in more professional development than ever before. Curriculum is changing to align with state standards. Pedagogical practice, teaching, is everywhere being reconsidered and altered for greater effectiveness. In other words, the stakes are the direct cause of substantial change in Massachusetts schools. As proponents of standards-based reform, we acknowledge the limits of tests and the cautions issued by virtually all testing experts and associations not to make life-altering determinations on the basis of a single test. We also believe that before we hold children responsible for their share of the learning, we should engage in the difficult work of holding adults accountable for having given children the opportunity to learn. Adults are stronger and better organized to resist accountability than children. Nonetheless, our strategy requires that educator accountability with real stakes should precede student accountability. We have more work to do on this in Massachusetts. However, none of these cautions dispels my belief, as the great teacher leader Al Shanker frequently argued, students must also have real consequences attached to their educational efforts. We must proceed to build the new system in whatever way we can while ensuring fairness in the process. If some schools have, as seems likely, failed in the near term to provide a fair opportunity to learn to some children in the Commonwealth, then let the remedy be that the education system is enjoined with all dispatch to immediately deliver to those children the instruction and support that they need in order to attain mastery. Further, the state should be obligated to operate an accountability system which guarantees that each and every school district lives up to its responsibility to provide each child with a full and fair opportunity to learn. In other words, let the remedy be giving the children what they need to meet the standard, not abandoning the standard. Under a high-stakes system, we must fairly and appropriately administer the consequences. Here's what we've done so far. We have some of the nation's highest and best standards for student learning. These standards, as well as many of the test items which constitute the MCAS, have been largely written by teachers. Once again, the standards and the tests are designed to focus on those skills and that knowledge which university leaders and employers have said are required for satisfactory entry-level, non-remediated performance. The state assesses student progress at several intervals as they progress through the education system. There are no stakes attaching to MCAS performance until grade 10, when students must achieve a competency determination on MCAS in English and math as a prerequisite for graduation. They must also meet all other local graduation requirements to receive a diploma. Students have 5 chances to pass the MCAS prior to graduation. Soon there will be even more testing opportunities. There is an appeals process that seeks to equate classroom performance with expected MCAS performances in instances where students feel that MCAS consistently fails to measure their genuine level of achievement. There is a certificate of attainment for those who have met local graduation requirements but fail to achieve an MCAS competency determination and want to be recognized with their class on graduation day. The MCAS consists of multiple assessment modalities, essay, short answer, and multiple choice items. About 40% of the test score is based on open-ended items, allowing consideration of a student's work process. The state has made massive investments in remedial opportunities which happen during and after school hours and in the summer. The state is also committed to sticking with students for as long as it takes for each one to achieve competency. In other words, no one is guaranteed a diploma in 4 years, but you are guaranteed the help you need to achieve competency, and the Commonwealth will support you throughout the process. Our critics claim that withholding a diploma for failure to achieve the competency standard on MCAS is a punishment to the student. We believe that although failure to graduate on time with one's class can be a painful inconvenience, it is a far greater injustice for educators to pass students on to college or employment knowing they lack the skills or knowledge that will likely be required to meet the next challenges in their lives. Instead of a punishment, we offer the benefit of additional education to each student, an education specifically aimed at providing that student the skill and knowledge he or she needs to be successful. No one can guarantee a diploma in 4 years, but the Commonwealth is now creating an entitlement for each student to attain competency, if not proficiency. That does not sound like a punishment to us. Our critics also urge us to be wary of high standards and high stakes precipitating an increased dropout rate. Thus far, we have no evidence that this is happening, but obviously there is a risk that students who fail to attain the standard will grow discouraged and could conceivably leave school as a result. This would clearly be an undesirable side effect. Here again, the critics prescribe their stock remedy: eliminate the dropout risk by lowering standards and eliminating stakes. We assert that the way to address student discouragement is to reshape schools and the education process that students who experience initial failure are enveloped in a supportive safety net of wraparound services which provide them with quality instruction and real hope. The stakes here are high. No one should underestimate the severity of withholding a diploma. However, the programmatic and financial supports are substantial. The process is fair. Massachusetts, in an effort to build capacity, has more than doubled the state's commitment in constant dollars to education. We are making progress. Our goal of having everyone meet the new higher standards is within reach. Most importantly, the results to date show that any kind of student, from any background or ethnicity, can achieve the standard if the learning conditions are right. In fact, an overwhelming majority, tens of thousands of students representing virtually all subcategories of students in the first class, the class of 2003, have already attained the standard. This demonstrates that the standard is reasonable and well within reach of all of our students. They are not prevented from attaining the standard by virtue of their DNA, their race, social class, or their neighborhood. They can do it if we figure out how to assist each and every one. A few samples of the results to date. For the class of 2003, at the end of 4 of 5 pre-graduation exams, 94% of all students have passed the English MCAS, 91% have passed the math exam, 90% have passed both exams. For the class of 2003, 83% of African American students have passed English, 79% passed math, and 75% passed both. For Hispanics, the numbers are 80%, 75%, and 70%. For limited English proficient, 72%, 77%, and 67%. And for disabled students, 79%, 72%, and 69% have passed both exams. For the class of 2004, 86% passed the English exam on the first try, 75% passed the math on the first try. For the class of 2004, 2/3 of African American students passed the English exam on the first try, up from 60% the preceding year. 61% of Latino students passed English on the first try, up from 52% the preceding year. At the University Park Campus School, a small inner-city public school in my hometown of Worcester, 100% of their completely low-income and mostly minority student body has passed the 10th grade MCAS in both subjects for 2 years running. It can be done if we get the conditions of teaching and learning right. The Massachusetts Department of Education recently reported a host of indicators on the Commonwealth's outstanding and improving performance on a number of national and international indicators. Notable among these, quote, the number of African American and Hispanic students choosing to take high-level math and science courses has risen more in Massachusetts than in any other state. One final comment on results. A number of our districts are, not surprisingly, finding a strong correlation between student attendance and MCAS performance. There appears to be a direct correlation between regular attendance and performance at the competency level. In other words, if they show up, they and their schools can do it. We are right to be deeply concerned about those who might fail to graduate from high school due to the enforcement of stakes for performance on statewide assessments. We have an ongoing obligation to these students, a promise to stick with them and give them whatever they need in order to attain proficiency. At a minimum, we should use performance data to hold their teachers and schools accountable for providing a high-quality opportunity to learn for all students, provide students with fair opportunities to appeal high-stakes decisions and to present alternative evidence of mastery. Most importantly, we must guarantee them continuing education of indefinite duration so that they may attain proficiency. Again, students are not necessarily entitled to graduate in 4 years, but they are entitled to the support they need in order to attain proficiency. This entitlement requires more instructional time before, during, and after normal school hours. It requires a wider range of instructional strategies. It may require additional outside support services. It means using summers and additional semesters, whatever it takes to achieve proficiency. Time is no longer the constant in education. Learning is the constant, and time must vary to meet the educational needs. The new educational promise is about mastery, not seat time. Retention and social promotion are out. They don't work. However, more instructional time, different kinds of instruction, higher expectations, and more opportunities will work. In the end, helping students to mastery is infinitely preferable to passing them on unqualified to probable failure, because in our misguided sympathy, we see it as generous to exempt them from the kind of stakes in education that life routinely imposes on them. They don't need waivers or exemptions or protection. They need an opportunity to learn. Standards-based reform and the assessment and stakes that animate it are a conspiracy against the pervasive soft discrimination of low expectations. That is why this reform is premised on the belief that all students can attain the high standards of proficiency. We know this to be the case. We have widespread evidence that it's true. The challenge ahead is to hold everyone in education responsible for providing the teaching and learning conditions that will enable all children to attain the standard. There is a great temptation among many of those sympathetic to the plight of the poor and minority youth to shoot the messenger, to deny the evidence of assessment, to dispute the stakes, to avoid the real issue of the failure of our current educational system to provide all of our children with what they need to be successful in life. We have long had disparate impact embodied in the day-to-day operations of an educational system riddled with widespread inequities. This system has persistently underserved low-income and minority youth. Those from communities of privilege, the well-educated, the affluent, should hesitate before declaring that these standards are too high or unfair to expect of low-income and minority children. The evidence contradicts this view. And furthermore, cynics who call this phenomenon Scarsdale-Brookline syndrome construe this opposition as an attempt to preserve the historic advantages of privilege. Of course, there is no question that poverty is a powerful and persistent obstacle to learning. Standards-based reformers acknowledge the injury of poverty, reject the temptation to give up on children by declaring poverty as destiny, and embrace the strategies needed to make education truly matter in improving the prospects of those born into economic disadvantage. As a nation, we make a gigantic investment in schooling. We have an obligation to expect and to deliver educational results. We know that education has been the ladder out of poverty for many. It can be done. Our challenge is to make that ladder work for everyone. It's a long, hard route. We're far from there, but we are making progress. The stakes associated with the evidence of assessment provide significant incentives to all parties for educational improvement, for the elimination of educational inequality. To remove the stakes undercuts the vital urgency of the reforms and would allow us to fall back into that pre-reform world governed by what so many have called the soft tyranny of low expectations. Once again, rather than expending our energies debating the instruments of accountability, we should be waging an educational war, replete with an army of strategies for educational improvement, to overwhelm that tyranny so that all our children will be proficient and prepared to succeed in life. It will not be easy, but we know we can do far better. The quest is to get the conditions of teaching and learning right for each and every student. This is what we must strive for. We need the courage to continue our quest on behalf of those children we have so miserably failed in the past. That is our argument. We, all of us, need to move on. The challenges are excellence and equity. Thank you for your time and attention.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Paul Reville discussing education reform, assessing success. You might want to come back because I'm going to ask you the first question. You made a powerful case for excellence and equity, but you talked about MCAS and testing nationally, including the testing now mandated under the No Child Left Behind Act. I want to ask you, how do you prevent the standards that are embodied in high-stakes testing, that high-stakes testing is the instrument you talked about that is being used to measure achievement of these standards? How do you prevent these standards from becoming a ceiling on achievement rather than just a minimal floor of mastery?
Right, it's a good question, and it's something that some folks worry about, although we have an awful long way to go before that happens. Most of these instruments allow for a wide range of achievement, and if you look at the MCAS test as I suggested, you'll find some questions in there that are of a very high level that define not just proficiency but advanced performance on these tests. And I think if we get to an adult accountability system in education that really focuses in on the degree to which a school or a school system adds value to a student's learning, we will measure the rate at which they improve. You know, we often talk about failing schools, and we look at absolute scores in looking at schools, and we think, well, gee, all the failing schools just happen coincidentally to be in our cities, you know, around the state. And it's interesting to wonder what would happen if the same kids who are in the schools in the cities were transplanted to some of our suburban schools and see how much progress those schools, which by virtue of their performance of students currently are rated highly, would make with students that have a much bigger challenge ahead of them. So I think that the emphasis in accountability ought to be on the degree to which every school improves every child's learning. And there ought to be rewards for advancement, no matter where you start. If it's way below or if it's way above the minimum competency standard, you ought to be rewarded.
Right now, the focus really has become that minimum competency standard, especially this year when the stakes are very high for the first class of students who may or may not receive diplomas in a few months. And the focus of the discussion really seems to have narrowed in on that minimum standard, that minimum score required. Well, I think you're 2 points away from the minimum score, and you can appeal. Yeah. So how do we move beyond that?
I think you're right. There has been a disproportionate emphasis on that group of students or that competency level that many students who historically have failed are struggling to meet now. And one of the things that I often say in response to that is we've spent years and years ignoring this population. So now that we may be over-focusing on them for a while, doesn't particularly disturb me because I don't think it in any way constrains performance on MCAS. I used to do a lot of speaking out in the suburbs on the subject of MCAS, and the question that you raised was a common question to be raised out in the suburbs, that this might hold us back. And so there used to be, prior to the first round of MCAS tests that happened that were consequential for 10th graders, these suburban audiences would be huge and be irate over matters of principle about MCAS and the standards associated with them. When that first round of consequential tests happened and it became apparent that very few people in the suburbs were going to fail, that audience disappeared in those communities. And in my view, so did the principal. What they were really concerned about is this in any way going to be an impediment for our children? And what was deemed not to be, well, they went back about their business, and if their business was above the competency level, they were happy to devote their time and attention as they always had to that. So, I think the emphasis of your question is right, that everybody who attends school, whether they're above or below the competency standards, is entitled to be challenged. And we need to build incentives into our accountability system to make sure that all children are challenged.
Do you have some ideas of the kinds of incentives you could build to move back to the principle and away from this temporary focus on the minimum standard? How would you move back?
Well, again, if you were going to design a reward system that in fact made a direct connection between how much new learning students acquired at a school during a given period of time, irrespective of where they started, how much value added was contributed during that period of time in the school, and reward teachers either individually or collectively for those learning gains in which they had participated. I mean, I believe learning is co-produced by teachers and students, and both should be accountable. Then you'd have a system that would reward challenging and improving the learning in every student.
Has any state discussed that kind of a reward?
There is discussion of it. Some states have moved forward in terms of even developing measurement instruments. I mean, unfortunately, given the current saturated climate as far as testing goes, this kind of accountability system requires even more in the way of testing. You'd have to test students at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year and look at the differences. So there's not necessarily a public appetite for that right at the moment.
I'm sure that would be very popular.
Right. So, and there's a lot of, as I said earlier, there are a lot of points of resistance in an industry that historically did not have arguably any accountability feature to it, and maybe you could make a case there was some accountability, but very little accountability for performance and for student learning, to introduce the idea that now people in that system are going to be evaluated on the basis of their performance. It's very hard going politically.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is a variant of a question I wanted to ask every speaker in our series. What, from your perspective, needs to be done to bring society and the schools into a new agreement, a new social contract over this issue of assessment and accountability?
Well, first of all, I think communities want to have schools or should be drawn into creating schools that reflect their values and what they feel schools should accomplish for them. So that developing in ways in which states and communities construct standards, I think it's very important to involve the citizens in the development of those standards. Here in Massachusetts, when we first wrote, when I was on the Board of Education, the Common Core of Learning, we had over 60,000 people participate in one way or another in contributing to those documents. And in the initial curriculum frameworks that were developed in Massachusetts, there were thousands of teachers that participated in the early going on those. So I think to the degree that you involve the society in shaping the standards, you then get the society to buy into the ways and means of assessing it. What we're doing in standards-based reform appeals to most people. When you look at the when you measure public opinion about having standards in public education, or testing to measure performance, or even having stakes associated with those tests, in the abstract, support is very high for those things. When you take it in a particular situation, when it applies to my child at this particular school, well, that's another matter. People begin to get a little nudgy about that. But still, there's remarkably high support for these methodologies because there's nothing arcane about them. They're common sense kind of techniques. They're often criticized as being corporate methods, but they're not really corporate methods. They're the same methods that you'd use to manage your own personal budget, or most of us, irrespective of our professions, use to manage our work. We set goals. We periodically take stock of where we are in terms of meeting our goals. We adapt or refine our approach in accordance with how we feel we're doing. And ultimately, there are some consequences in life for all of us based on our performance. And that's what we've tried to embody in a system of reform that is aligned with reality in the outside world. So I think there's a lot of public support for it, but I think the key is to involve people in helping to shape the standards.
Well, that's the society part of it, but you alluded to the systemic resistance, the school resistance as well. What would bring the schools into this process ultimately? My
students are used to hearing me harp on this point that people support what they help create. And I think when you're doing reform and when you're doing large-scale reform in states or, God knows, in the nation, you have to include the people who are on the front line doing the work in the shaping of the reform strategy and in shaping the instruments of reform. And we have had a up and down history in Massachusetts in terms of our track record in involving teachers and administrators in shaping the instruments of reform. When I was on the Board of Education, I'm proud to say I think we did a pretty good job of getting a lot of people in the field on board with shaping those standards, devising the tests, developing the cut scores, thinking about the ways in which the field could be notified of the results, things of this nature. And there was a much better set of relationships between policymakers in the field. Beginning about 1996, the relationships between the field and the policy community soured because a new philosophy took hold, and that philosophy seemed to be suggesting that we could do reform to the field rather than with them. And that's backfired. Now we have a fairly sour relationship, I would submit, between policymakers in the field over this. It would have been tough under the best of circumstances because introducing accountability, as we are doing this spring here, was always going to be rough going. But it's particularly tough in that there hasn't been that kind of collaborative relationship with the field.
You know, you follow some of the national movements, and I promise this will be my last question. How have other states, how has the federal No Child Left Behind legislation done in terms of process?
Well, I mean, the federal legislation is a whole new question. This is an unprecedented movement of the federal government into state and local education affairs with principles that are based on the Texas standards-based reform model and are highly consistent with what we're doing here in Massachusetts. The problem is in the details and the instruments of reform. So laying a federal reform architecture on top of an ambitious set of reforms that are already midstream here in Massachusetts is inevitably imposed a whole variety of operational problems. So I don't know that the federal government, and here I'd hold both parties accountable, did as thorough a job as they might have done at consulting with people in the field about the ways and means they might apply their principles to educational improvement. And there's a lot of evidence in this bill, particularly the average yearly progress indicator that's an important part of the federal bill, that doesn't seem to have much basis in practice or science.
Thank you. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Paul Reville discussing education reform, assessing success. The floor is now open for your questions and comments. If you would line up at the aisle microphone. And just do feel free to line up.
My name is Sylvia Jones, and I have a school in my house. That's why I'm here, and you're talking about school. And I created this school myself, and I can run my school. I have nobody to interfere with my school. And so I'm just passing on an idea because it's really working.
Thank you.
Good. That's excellent.
Yes, your question?
My name is LANLAN. I have a question I would like to ask. Why MCAS is only testing English, language arts, and math for competency determination for students? It is as if these two courses are the only two core subjects for Massachusetts students. In 1993, when Massachusetts Education Reform Act was signed into law, Department of Education moved forward with 7 subjects and developed the curriculum frameworks for those 7 subjects: English, math, science, history, foreign language, arts, and health. And when MCAS was signed into law, 5 subjects were identified as core subjects, and they are English, math, science, social studies, foreign language. These 5 subjects are supposed to be all included in the comprehensive assessment system, but today Department of Education is only testing English and math for accountability and leaving the other important subjects totally out of the system, the assessment system. And my feeling is a subject like foreign language is totally relegated to non-subject, non-core subject status. So I would like to know whether Mass Inc. is aware of the situation, and if you do, how do you have a plan to bring these core subjects back into the assessment system? Thank you.
It's a good question, and it's something that's been happening in a lot of states that's gotten right into the middle of a discussion about what is it that states ought to be held responsible for insisting on in terms of performance at the local level. And I think what's been prevailing in terms of the response to this is that the state has had, you're quite right in your description, there were actually 8 subjects in the original bill, and they were folded into 7 defined subjects for which curriculum frameworks were developed. Some of those subjects were thought to present particular difficulties in terms of doing assessments, either from a cost factor or, in the case of the arts, from a state-of-the-art of assessment factor. So the state decided, at least initially, to focus on 4 subjects in terms of developing its first round of assessments. And it decided that in order to make it made a decision that the first consequential test would be math and English. There was every intention, I think, of moving on down the line and at least including history and social studies, which is now scheduled. Whether it happens or not is another matter, and the sciences, and maybe even moving along to the other subjects in due course. However, the controversy surrounding the math and English standards has been so fierce and furious that the technical difficulties of making this happen in a way that was fair and reasonable and allowing for appeals has so overwhelmed the state that there's a good deal of thinking at the state level right now that maybe the state ought to be responsible for assessing in large-scale assessments just the bare minimum subjects, and then having an adult accountability that forces local systems to have their own assessment mechanisms to measure performance against the state standards in those other subjects. But there's some feeling that it's both practically, politically, operationally, maybe even financially, certainly under current circumstances, infeasible to have the state doing assessment all across the board in as comprehensive a way as all those subjects would suggest.
I have 2 related comments and then 2 quick questions. And the comment was when you were talking about measuring a school, how school is doing by change. And if that is in fact how schools are measured, that will not address the inequity. Inequity will continue because every school is chasing a moving target, and so then you're back to your initial issue around addressing inequity. Also, if that is in fact how schools are measured and that testing goes into place, you said that the suburban parents backed off once they saw testing wasn't an issue for them. They won't back off because testing will continue to be an issue for their school's funding because they have to, it's based on improvement. So those are my 2 comments. 2 quick questions is, I do believe that you get what you measure, so I'm not necessarily an anti-standards person. And a question is, as those percentages that you read off go up, which I believe they will, are the MCAS going to change to become more challenging, or are they static? Have you decided this is what kids need to know, end of story? Or as the schools do better on them, are you going to make the test harder and harder? That's the first question. And the second question is, you mentioned that there is a certificate of attainment for students who meet their high school's requirements but don't pass the MCAS. And you also mentioned that schooling needs to be about learning rather than about seat time. And so then I'm assuming, but I'm wondering whether there's talk around also having some certificate for kids who pass the MCAS and have very little interest in doing any more seat time, going to PE, taking home ec, whatever the other things are, and that they can go out into the world saying, I have achieved the competencies, done with seat time, I'm ready for work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you've really asked, for at least you've raised 4 things that I want to comment on, your 2 comments and your 2 questions. You're quite right about the moving gap, although it's quite possible, and in fact the new federal No Child Left Behind system incorporates I think, to a degree that's unmanageable, but nonetheless incorporates differential expectations for different schools depending on the size of the gap that's there. So you might set a more ambitious gap for a school that has farther to go than you would for a school, another school. So there are ways of rewarding everybody based on improvement, but moving toward closing the gap. And this is certainly what No Child Left Behind contemplates. Whether it's workable in the terms that they've set, I'm not sure. On what you described as if we made improvements on the basis, if we made rewards on the basis of improvement, I don't think anybody's talking about withholding funds from non-improving schools. I mean, maybe if a school was persistently underperforming over a period of time.
It's more that maybe it's not funding, but your curriculum. I think one of the concerns of suburban parents in the highly achieving areas is they don't want their curriculum to have to be tied to a test. They want the teachers to go and do the wonderful things that the teachers have been doing with their kids always. Mm-hmm. So if it's still tied to a test, they want to decouple their curriculum from the testing. Right now they see they can do that. Mm-hmm. But if this continues to be testing that's specifically for them, then they'll see the curriculum isn't being decoupled from testing, and they'll stay.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess my feeling on that is if the standards are properly written, and in some of our subjects they are and some they aren't. For example, history, social studies, I don't think they're properly written. But in English, for example, I think they're well written. If they are, then I don't think I think the standards allow for a fair variability in terms of teaching practice that would not confine practice in some of the suburban districts you described to simply rigid adherence to the particular test. Let me go to your two questions. The tests change every time out because Massachusetts does a good thing, which is to disclose the test items. As I advise you, you can go on the website and look at them. This is expensive to do it this way, but there are new items every time. Virtually all the items are disclosed. A few are held back for purposes of testing out items and calibrating this test to the next test and so forth. But so the test items are out there all the time. It's not so much whether the test will change, it's whether the standards will change. And I think there will be a tendency to rewrite these standards over time. Again, No Child Left Behind is, in certain senses, and its incentives, penalizing, in other cases challenging, you might say, states like Massachusetts to move the standard up. No Child Left Behind requires a proficiency standard for all students within 12 years by the year 2014. In our terminology currently in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has submitted an accountability system based on this presumption, we will get 100% of our students to the 240 level by the year 2014. So this builds in an automatic ratcheting up. Again, whether that's realistic or not, I don't know, but certainly it's built in there, and it is contemplated that the bar will go up. Massachusetts, to its credit, again, look at what the competency determination and look at advanced level. These are fairly ambitious standards. If you look by comparison at Texas, you will see they started much lower and made a decision to do what you're describing, move the standard up as you go along. It's politically more comfortable. You don't have all the anxiety we had a year ago about this. But we started at a fairly high level. We are arguably the first state to do both high stakes and high standards simultaneously. And that's why there's so much national attention focused on us right now. As far as your last question goes relative to should they be a bit like going to an English university, that it doesn't really matter whether you attend class or not, but you pass the test. I doubt it because what the framers of the Reform Act were trying to achieve was to respect local graduation requirements and say, really communities first and foremost define what's required for graduation. But because we have such huge variability between communities, we're going to make sure you have at least a minimum level of English and math coming out. And so we will honor the work and the many years of time that you spent there if you didn't attain that competency standard by acknowledging it with a certificate, which for the most part kids don't want. I mean, they really want a diploma. I doubt that it would go the other way.
Hi, my name is Larry Ward. I'm a parent of 3 public school students, and I work for CARE, which is a Coalition for Authentic Reform in Education. And I have a couple comments. and maybe a question or two, Paul. And my comment, my first comment is around, I counted about at least no less than 5 times when you suggested that we move on and get on with the business of making things happen. And my comment about that is the inherent bias in that kind of a statement, Paul, is that you're assuming that that by not moving on and going forward, that we're not with you. Everybody wants high standards, and everybody believes in high standards. I don't think we're going to get an argument on that. But to say to end the debate is assuming that your side is right and everybody else is wrong by saying, end this debate and move on. And I would suggest that, and until you have a system that people can believe and trust that will work for all kids, it's very difficult to say, or at least to have people to move on. So that's one comment. You talked several times about fairness, again, which you and I agree on what fairness is and what it should be. I would suggest that anytime you have a system such as the MCAS that has such wide disparity between groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, that there doesn't seem to be any fairness built into that type of a system. You gave your numbers in terms of the 90% pass rate. That, I believe, according to the DOE, is based on the people who took the MCAS. But if you go back to the entire class, the 2003 class, in fact, there's, according to the DOE, the pass rate would be 76%. And you have a much higher rate of failure among minorities at the same time. So I think you raise a good question when you talk about fairness, but I don't think that's a good answer, that the MCAS becomes a good answer for a tool for fairness. If we look at opportunity to learn, which is what most people want, again, we agree that what we're talking about is an opportunity to learn. When the frameworks have changed, as they have so many times, you haven't created an opportunity to learn, or the state hasn't created an opportunity to learn this particular material. And according to some estimates, based on what's in the MCAS, it would take people, maybe 12, 15 years to learn the information in order to pass the MCAS, to be successful at it. I'm not sure, from what I've been able to see and observe, that students have had the opportunity to learn, but they've been held accountable. You talked a lot about accountability, and they're being held accountable when, in fact, adults aren't being held accountable for what's happening to students. And that's a grave concern to me. Students are being told they're not going to graduate based on a system that was, even though it was the 1993 Reform Act, based on the MCAS that they've taken basically recently, if you want to look at it in terms of opportunity to learn. And the numbers are showing high failure rates, again, still. So I don't think we've created an environment where people have an opportunity to learn. Let me just get to a question. When we talk about, when you talk about the whole issue of the items in the test changing, and that's a good thing, that these items will change, and which makes sense. I, as a parent, have gone to the DOE. You say the items are online. That's true, but you can't get the test. Many people have tried to get the test to sort of see what their kid did wrong and how they can help their kid improve, go to the MCAS prep classes and what have you, and you can't get that. And I'm wondering, is there any plan really to make that available to parents in a way that will help their students, help their kids to be able to do better if we accept that the MCAS is a valid tool? Another question that I have is in terms of people learn in different ways. You have 6 kids, and I'm sure they all have varying learning styles. A fundamental question in that would be, how can one test measure everything that a kid needs to learn to be successful and go out into the community? I'll stop there, give you a chance to respond.
Okay. You want me to give a whole nother speech, Larry, or? Well, I got 5 points that I want to respond to in what you said, and you know, I think we agree on some things and different assumptions on other things. Okay, number one, you say, well, you know, by saying we ought to move on from this debate, it seems to embody a kind of arrogance that I'm right, you're wrong, so let's get going and move ahead. I've been on the other end of this. This is what I call the John Silver School of Compromise. You move to my position and we go forward. And I hope I'm not doing that. What I guess I am saying is we've been talking about this for an awful long time. I've been talking with you and your colleagues at Fair Test and CARE and every other group around about, you know, whether this test is appropriate, whether its items are fair, et cetera, and yet still in all, as a matter of policy, there's been a huge public discussion about this, and policymakers, we have Representative Kaufman here, and he's going to be speaking next time. The policy community has not decided to abandon this, so it is the rule of law here, and now it's become the rule of law as far as the federal government goes. And it is being challenged in court, and maybe the courts will turn it back. And if they do, we'll have to go back to the drawing boards. But I guess what I'm saying is it appears that this is here to stay, for better or worse. And I allowed in my remarks that you may like it or you may dislike it, just as I say to my students in class. But you're going to have to live with it one way or another. So it's in that spirit that I say we need to put our collective energies less on you trying to tell me what's wrong with the test and me trying to tell you what's right with the test, and more trying to say, well, we've got these 6 students in front of us, each of whom, as you say, learns in a different way. How do we get each of them to the level of competency that's going to allow them to be successful as they move on in life? That's really what I want to focus on. And I'm just worried that if we burn up all our energy fighting with one another over whether this test is a good test or a bad test, we won't get to what we're really concerned about, which is student learning. And I think there's enough evidence that it's a decent test. It's certainly no worse than a lot of tests we used to give before, and it doesn't show anything very different. When you talk about unfairness, it shows the same spread that correlates with socioeconomic status for the most part. You know, that more affluent kids generally tend to demonstrate more learning on this kind of test, and that's probably representative of the quality of educational experience they have. And so, to me, that's the real problem. And the question is, what do we do about that? And I think the wide disparity that you're talking about is indicative of the unfairness that's embodied in the system. And when you say to me, you know, your second point was that how can we have a test that has such wide disparity of performance and think that it would be fair? Well, I think the system that it is measuring is unfair, and it is finally giving us that result so we can put it in the face of policymakers, and we can put it in the face of teachers and whatnot, and educational leaders, and say, now you've got to do something about this. Now it really matters. Hey, you know, for a long time, look at dropout rates. Look at virtually any indicator you have. Low-income and minority children come out at the bottom, and there are huge disparities. That's the whole point of this, is there were huge disparities between what it was that you got if you were being educated in Wellesley versus what it was you got if you were being educated in Chelsea. And it was okay for educators and policymakers, state officials and others to regard what you were getting in Chelsea as fine. As long as they gave you a diploma, that was fine. You must be doing something well. But we all knew what it meant to get a Chelsea diploma versus getting a diploma here. Sure, there are exceptions to the rule. But you know, there were these huge disparities. And I think that we've gotten 90% to a fairly ambitious standard, and yes, there are still gaps, but those gaps appear to be closing, is cause for a modest celebration, not a huge celebration, but a modest celebration. I agree with you that we haven't held adults as accountable as we should have in this. And I think it's very tough work, for reasons that I mentioned in my remarks. And I think that we have got to do a better job. It is not fair from a legal, educational, ethical, whatever standpoint to ask a student to demonstrate mastery in something that you haven't taught them in school. And there are instances where this happens. I think it's happening less and less. Were I a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the Commonwealth, that's what I'd focus on, because I think there are places where we haven't done that. But again, even if you can prove that and show that, to my mind, the remedy is not to say, oh, well, we shouldn't have standards because a couple of places got it wrong and couldn't align their curriculum with the standards or couldn't find quality teachers or whatever it might be. I think the remedy is to say, well, let's put the screws to them. They need to get good teachers in there. They need to be teaching high-powered courses. They need to align their curriculum with the tests so that the students can do well. As to your point on reports to the parents, I think we could probably do a better job on that. Massachusetts has some reports to the parents. I get them. You get them. The item analysis is available to teachers. I mean, teachers do get an item-by-item analysis of each question and how each student did on each question. And there's some substantial evidence now that they're using that to change their practice in the classroom. So what you're saying is, can we make that available to parents? And again, I don't speak for the state here. Certainly it's possible. Would I like to see it happen? Yeah, I think it would be a good idea. Unfortunately, not all parents are as interested as you are, but I think it would be a good thing. And then finally, your different strokes for different kids point, I think is an important one. And I don't think that, I think the ways in which we measure learning, I'm delighted that we have an appeals process. There are hundreds of students who've moved forward under the appeals process and shown that they have competency that isn't measured by MCAS tests. So we've created a method for that. But we also, again, embodied in the standards is not to say you have to teach in any particular way. If I want to teach you one way and this gentleman another way as a teacher in a classroom, I have the opportunity to do that. And the tests, while they're limited by all the constraints that are on statewide standardized testing, do allow a variety of different formats in which students can demonstrate their learning. So, is it perfect? No. But we're a lot better off than we were, and I think you'd have to agree that these tests are a lot better than many of the norm reference tests that were standard practice in our field for a long time.
Just a quick... Usually my voice is loud enough. First of all, just a quick correction. I do very much believe in standards. So that point we agree on, that we all agree that we should have standards. Whether or not there should be one way just to measure a kid's learning after 12, 13 years in school is a huge gap, a huge disagreement, and therefore it makes it very difficult to go on again.
But let me stop you there, Larry, because there isn't one way to measure a student's learning here. First of all, you have to meet the local graduation standard. You have dozens of courses that you've had to achieve and demonstrate mastery in. So there are a whole variety of ways in which students have demonstrated competency there. And then I think you're referring to MCAS, and you're saying that there's one way on that test to show that you're competent. And I would argue there are different ways.
Well, no, I'm saying that it's one test. I'm not saying there's one way on the test. I'm saying there's one test, in that if any one of us in our jobs were just judged on one thing, it would be, and we're kicked out of our jobs based on one thing, that would be a very punitive, we would see that as a very punitive system. That being said, I think the young woman here addressed the issue in terms of whether or not, if you just met the MCAS requirement. My daughter asks me all the time, if I take the test and I pass, can I quit school?
And what do you say to her?
Absolutely not. So that's not the point in terms of whether or not you use this instrument. It's whether or not you use a variety of instruments, because that's how we all agree as educators how kids learn and adults learn. is through a variety of assessment measures, not just through one.
That's right. And nobody, I think, in the Commonwealth or in any other state intended that these tests be the only form of assessment in a school. Good teachers use assessment all the time and use a variety of different ways of assessing students' performance.
But this is the only one that can keep you from getting a diploma. And that is a critical point in terms of the high-stakes nature of it. If MCAS were the measure that was chosen, they got to use a measure. You mentioned that, it gave us all this information. It didn't give us one iota of information that we didn't already know about kids. We knew, you and I both, and most of the people in this room understood where the kids were failing. So basically what we've done is pumped a whole lot of money into a system that gave us more of the same information when, in fact, we didn't use the money to, in fact, address the problem of the kids that were failing, because we kind of knew that already. I think we probably would agree that we knew where the kids
We knew where the kids were, but this gives us a more refined diagnostic tool, and because it counts, because there are stakes, it creates an urgency to do something about it that we didn't have before. But let me ask you, let's assume I conceded to your argument. We say, well, okay, the standards are inappropriate, or we both believe in standards, but let's just say the test is inappropriate. We're not going to have this test. Let's wipe it off. No test, no stakes. What do? How are we going to close that achievement gap? What would you put in place if we don't do this?
I think you again go back to the system that you had, that you started down the path with the Department of Ed when Dan French was there, when he had gone out into all these teachers. The curriculum frameworks as a whole, that was an excellent idea. That went a long way. When they gathered all that information, the prevailing thought was that they're going to use this to come up with a way to educate kids and make sure that there's some learning involved in it. And then it sort of switched somewhere down the line, and it turned into the one test type of thing. So, I think there's a variety of things that we can do. You and I we've discussed this and could talk about this many times. So it's not that anybody or that I'm suggesting that you get rid of standards. I absolutely want standards. I absolutely want to know with some degree of where kids are, and testing would be included in that for me, because that is a way to determine on certain issues where kids are. But it would not be the way that one would use to determine whether a kid's future was at stake or not. That's the difference.
I just think if we had curriculum frameworks but didn't have any urgency associated with them, nobody would pay any attention to them.
Just to switch gears here a little bit, do you think that the Commonwealth is honoring its obligation to make sure, you said a student isn't guaranteed a diploma in 4 years, but they are guaranteed the help? My understanding is that a lot of the summer and after school and remedial instruction and support services that were supposed to be provided are not funded, and so are we honoring that obligation?
Well, I think we have been up until now. There's been an enormous investment in remedial education, and it has been honored. There's been a huge commitment of resources by the Commonwealth over the 10 years. What's going to happen during this budget crisis, I'm not sure. In terms of putting together the system that I described, basically a safety net system that would wrap services around those kids who fail, I think, honestly speaking, that we're behind on that relative to where we should be. For example, we've not been able to get the degree of cooperation between community colleges around the Commonwealth to effectively describe what their role is going to be. They're going to have a role. Some of them are now playing a role. The governor seems to have put money in his budget, whether that stays, to support those students going on to community college with or without a diploma. So I think we're moving to it. I would argue we're tardy. I've been arguing with the Department of Education for over a year now that this should have been in place. It's less clear what the K-12 role will be, although those schools are going to offer summer programs and testing and there's going to be another test in August. So I think employers have been included in this system. Community-based organizations in adult education are being drawn in. So I think my organization ran an event on this just last week because we want to push this as a public policy issue. My grade is that we're doing not as well as we should have been doing by this time. We should have been able in early March, when kids got notice, those that had taken the retest in December, that they would not be able to graduate with their class this June. We should have had a detailed, glossy brochure to each of those students that said, here are the pathways that are open to you in the future. And we didn't have that, and so I'm disappointed by that. But I think, notwithstanding that fact, there is now a renewed sense of commitment to bringing together the powers that be in state government to make that happen. So we'll see.
I want to ask you one last question. You talked about equity. The word equity came up, and fairness came up very, very often. And admittedly, there are inequities, and so there are some huge inequities in the system, and clearly the biggest one is money. Is there any vision for equalizing the money so that these low-achieving and low-income schools, low-achieving and low-income districts will have funding at the same level so that the Chelseas and the Welsleys are equal in terms of resources, and then perhaps have a leg up in terms of equalizing their outcomes?
Well, again, one of the things I'm proudest about in terms of this reform, that it's been very progressive in terms of moving a lot of money into the lowest income communities in the Commonwealth. And we've made a lot of progress in terms of describing and achieving a level of adequacy for every district in the Commonwealth. Now, adequacy is not equality. I'm not sure equality is even desirable, because I would argue in the school systems that serve the neediest children, we ought to, in fact, in reality, be spending more. Politics are such that you cannot put through a system that is going to restrain some communities from spending what they want to spend on education. But you can be parsimonious with your state aid and the way in which state aid is parceled out. And I think that obviously we're under great duress now as a result of the budget crisis and the cutbacks in the budget. So I think one thing to watch will be the way in which funds are apportioned in this budget crisis and the degree to which education funding is protected. And if you look at the detail, how it's protected. And I would look at that closely. We are now standing in a community that is living proof that money isn't everything in education. Cambridge spends more than just about anybody in the Commonwealth per student on education and has very poor performance. So we know that it isn't all about money. It's about how you spend the money and about your focus and about your goals and about your incentives and about your accountability system. That's what really makes the difference. But money isn't irrelevant either. And so I think that we, as I said earlier, ought to have a school finance system that's more closely aligned with our educational goals, and that we provide adequate resources and direction to those communities that have the biggest achievement gaps to address. But I think politically it'll take us quite a while to get there.
Thank you.
I think Cambridge, as a public school parent of Cambridge,
This is
Cambridge, because as a public school parent of Cambridge students, Cambridge also has a 3% dropout rate, 3% versus Chelsea, who apparently scored higher than Cambridge, which is being touted having a 43% dropout rate. So I would wonder, did these kids actually get learning, or did they just leave? So I think when we start talking about individual communities, it gets a little difficult.
Well, it does, but I think, Larry, in fairness, even if people aren't dropping out but they're not learning anything, that's not an achievement either. Well, that may say more about college admission standards than it says about what's going on in the Cambridge Public Schools. I think when you look at the performance data on what students are actually learning in Cambridge, it has to be disappointing to anybody who, like me, frequently is making the argument that beleaguered communities with high concentrations of low-income children need more money. It's living disproof that at certain levels that money matters. And no, it isn't. It's based on a whole host of other measures. And if Fairtest could put as much energy into improving the Cambridge Public Schools as it does to tearing down the MCAS, we'd be in good shape.
Thank you, Paul Reville.